Welcome to the Out and Back, your place for quick, convenient, and entertaining stories from in and around the endurance world. I'm your host, Miguel Mattox. The basic design of the bike emerged about 150 years ago, but a comprehensive understanding of what makes a bike fast is a much more recent development, really only gaining clarity in the last few decades. Then in the last 10 years, the focus has expanded much beyond just aero frames and the lightest possible build. For elite athletes, innovations in areas like cockpit setup, water bottle placement, and wheel design now provide measurable performance advantages. What were once considered niche modifications to be on display at the expo, such as integrated aero bar extensions and behind-the-saddle hydration systems, are now becoming essential sources of marginal gains. Additionally, new tech for measuring drivetrain efficiency and real-time aerodynamics are becoming increasingly accessible to the general consumer. With virtually every aspect of cycling now quantifiable, the sport is seeing an intense race for optimization, the limits of which may be reached sooner than we think. Following the half IRONMAN World Championship, our interview today will discuss key principles in current cycling technology. We'll examine how professional athletes optimize their fit on a time trial bike, customize components beyond stock frames, and fine-tune every detail just to keep up with their competition. Our primary goal with this interview is to critically assess which trends are just hype and what genuinely delivers a performance benefit. Our guest today is Mitch Child, an R&D engineer at Specialized Bikes. He works on the next generation of body geometry hardware and software, focusing on how technology can improve performance, comfort, and the overall experience on the bike. Mitch has a background in materials science, biomechanics, and sports engineering. His work now centers on aerodynamics, pressure sensing, and motion analysis, connecting data and design to what riders actually feel on the road. He's also a competitive triathlete and a USA Para-Triathlon guide. Mitch is passionate about the intersection of engineering and human performance and building tools that help athletes understand and push their limits. Mitch, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I want to have you kind of break down, because I think the majority of this conversation is going to be around aerodynamics and kind of emerging technology that enhances our aerodynamics on the bike. What are professionals looking at in terms of measurements? Hear the term CDA thrown around a lot by people who probably don't know what that means. And what's kind of like a standard baseline for professionals, and how low can we bring our CDA down to?
Yeah, so I guess winding the clock back a little bit, it must have been like the 80s or something, where like Aero really started to be a thing that people focused on and realized like, hey, this matters. The quantification of like how much it matters and how to optimize around it, especially with all like the other variables going on of, are you mechanically efficient? Are you dealing with your own physiology well? Are you, all of the things that go along with cycling and performance, where that falls in the tier list and how to fit it in wasn't, well optimized.
Right.
And I think, the tech that we have now, whether that's like CFD, computational fluid dynamics, a fully like digital approach, or aero testing in a wind tunnel or a velodrome, all those kinds of things, they're just kind of adding context to what that looks like and how all those pieces fit together.
Yeah.
And then, as you were saying, kind of like where performance falls on like the highest level and with amateurs, sometimes those variables, they matter more for certain groups than another.
Yeah.
For one example, like comfort for a really long event is a significantly more valuable thing to focus on than if your event is like a 40-minute time trial. So that's kind of like where that stuff shakes out, at least.
And that's a really good first point to make too, is like we often look at time trial specialists at the pro tour level and replicate their positions and equipment, but understand that they're probably severely uncomfortable by the end of 40 minutes trying to achieve that optimal position. And that's something we can't see.
Exactly. And so, I mean, sticking like back in the past, it was always thought that being really low and being really small was the fastest way to go. And the really small part is, it's going to hold true, but being really low doesn't necessarily equate to being faster. And there's like multiple reasons for that. One is that you're making it physiologically harder for yourself to push power, whether that's you cutting off your hip angle and impinging the ability to pedal, or it's just not as fast of a shape. So getting to your point with CDA, CDA is your drag coefficient times area. And there's really like two pieces there. There's the drag coefficient, which is like how fast is your shape. And then there's the area, which is just like how big are you and how much do you present to the wind.
Got it.
And that thing scales with speed, and the bigger you are, the bigger that number is going to be, but you can lower that number by also being, a better shape. So the top tier time trialists at the World Tour, they're, those numbers have been going down lower and lower, and that number is always going to be under 1 as well. So the numbers they're chasing are right around 0.14 to 0.15. We'll probably see some 0.14s this year at the World Tour. But those people are really small. They're, they're like freaks of nature, because they can push 400 watts while also weighing 125 pounds, and, like very small, skinny arms that can hide behind, and the helmets that are designed to fit around their bodies are like
everything
super
is completely optimized. Yeah,
exactly. And then like skin suits that are tailored to their bodies, so there's no wrinkles, all that kind of stuff. So those numbers are super world class. And then if we kind of trickle into triathlon, the demands are different, right? Like you were saying, you can't sit in this super aggressive, like tight position for like 2 to 4 hours, right? So the numbers that we're seeing there are sometimes under 0.2. Like the top guys that are really like optimized and on this kind of stuff are, in the 0.17, 0.18 realm, but the trade-offs of like things you're optimizing for definitely like bring those numbers up. I'd say there's a spectrum of talent as well, where you can make up a lot in triathlon with just really strong legs, right? And get away with a 0.21. But if you can push like 400 watts the entire race, then it doesn't even matter. But I think that the triathlon world could totally use a huge optimization in that space. But and then amateurs are falling somewhere on the back half of those same numbers.
Got it. And that's a good segue into the main point of our conversation, which is to identify trends in triathlon fresh off of the 70.3 World Championships, because as we know in triathlon, there are no UCI bike regulations. There are some regulations that we have to abide by, but in general, you kind of innovate and throw out whatever you want to throw out. I want to take this maybe a little piece by piece, because we could go down like every little niche on the bike. But I don't know, where do you want to start? What's kind of the standout, whether it was 70.3 World Championships, Kona, or before this year, what's kind of the standout trend in what you're seeing and how we're optimizing bikes in triathlon?
My bread and butter and what the trend that I'm seeing is position, and that like your position is by far the biggest determinant of performance for two reasons. One is that like, depending on how big you are, and like how much you present to the wind, your position can account for somewhere between 70 and even 90% of your total aerodynamic drag, which means that like your $16,000 bike or whatever is 20 to 30% of the total equation. So if you make your bike, 3% faster than last year's generation, that's 3% of 20%. So the position is really what is the biggest driver. And if we think about trends with position, it's starting to become a lot more obvious to everybody, not just, the select few that are doing crazy R&D stuff at the highest level, that the position is, that biggest piece. And the way that people are optimizing around that, at least in the triathlon world, is longer and in this case higher, which is kind of a divergent from prior thinking. A lot of people thought, short and low, and you're just trying to tuck and be small. But as we talked about earlier, that makes it really hard to put out power and be comfortable and handle the bike. So being able to go higher, further out, and also angling your arms so that you're hiding your head, which presents a huge amount of area to the wind behind your arms. That's kind of been the biggest trend in the last 3 or so years.
Yeah.
And then to couple that is equipment. Like you were saying, there aren't really regulations. And that's one of my like favorite parts of triathlon, is that like you can do crazy innovation. And I mean, in the last couple of years, we've had a little bit of regulation with how crazy you can get.
Yeah.
And, you know,
Yeah,
it's
I
probably
think for the better. Yeah.
Yeah. I think things were starting to get out of hand. But yeah, being able to couple equipment with those positional changes is huge. And I think that that's going to be the next wave, is equipment affecting your position, because aerodynamics is really complicated and nobody can see it, right? Like you can see deep wheels and be like, oh yeah, those are probably Aero. Like you really can't see it, and you don't know until you test, and you can make some fairly informed decisions, but again, you don't know until you test. And because we know that position matters the most and your bike can affect your position, I think that that's going to be the new wave, is equipment that is accommodated around positions.
That's a good point. And I'm thinking about the CDA formula that you mentioned, which is like the shape combined with your size. And I think a lot of taller, bigger athletes out there struggle with that concept, because it's like, I'm bigger, I'm at a disadvantage. But I think there's almost more opportunity if you're a larger being on a bike.
Well, and the bike matters less, right? Where,
Right.
you know, if you're 200 pounds and 6'4", your bike accounts for, 10%, maybe even less in some cases, of the aerodynamic package. Whereas, if you're 5'1" and 120, your bike actually does really matter. And then it's one thing to be able to come up with a really fast position. They have these fit bikes out there where their whole purpose is to be really adjustable and dynamic. And you can create a really crazy fast position, potentially digitally test it, or find a way to get on a tunnel or onto a track and test these positions. But if there are bikes out there that can't accommodate that, then you're kind of SOL. If for smaller riders, that's actually a really big problem.
What pieces of equipment, whether that's just like custom or, things that that bike manufacturers are producing these days, have you seen that lead into that trend of like, this is a part of the bike, but we're putting it on there to optimize your position on the bike?
Yeah, I'd say it's actually like bike manufacturers specifically have really not been able to move quickly to be able to accommodate a lot of these new positions we're seeing, like really long, really high, and bent elbows. So what I assume you're getting at is some of these reach extenders, which is a common product seen with some of these like boutique offerings, where it's essentially an adapter that goes from your base bar to your extensions and gives you significantly more reach. Those are the kind of things that I think are honestly pretty innovative and super valuable, because they affect your position so much. You're just able to do things you weren't able to do before. And, potentially at the cost of some limitations of hardware and maybe safety. If you're really far out over the top of like your bike, you're maybe trading off some handling at that point. But, bike manufacturers haven't caught up. So until then, like reach extenders, I think are a huge improvement. And I would say 90% of people could benefit from something like reach extenders. And then, once you do have a position that you're really confident in and is fast, going down the full custom route is totally an option. And that is where, at the highest end of the world tour, that is pretty much what everybody's doing. It's a significantly like expensive endeavor, and it's pretty cost prohibitive with relative gains. I mean, they are measurable gains to go fully custom, but they're so small compared to like the other stuff you can do. Yeah, those are kind of the two general places. Like people love to be excited about cockpits because they're exciting and fancy, and you throw in 3D printed titanium and everyone loses their minds, and rightly so, because it's really cool.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that too, because one of the other trends that you mentioned briefly was, obviously being low and tucked, but having your elbows super narrow. What is the purpose of that, and what equipment? I mean, I'm getting at the whole sled fad, which I think is, we almost saw like a lot of it, like everybody adapting it, and now we're seeing like not the best triathletes in the world, like almost using just regular poles because they've probably tested faster for one reason or another. The narrow elbow trend, and what equipment are we seeing to like fulfill that aerodynamic benefit?
The narrow elbows, it's somewhat intuitive as to why it's faster, right? Like you are presenting less to the wind, and it's at the very front of the bike and the whole system. And the front is going to matter more because it's the first thing to see the wind. So going narrower, it generally, like 9 times out of 10, I'd say you are going to be faster by bringing your elbows together. And there are a lot of like cups out there and sleds and designs that push those things together. A lot of these like slotted arm cups that have really high sides and kind of squish you together. That's also really common. You know, it potentially comes at the penalty of being able to like breathe. I mean, at some point, if you go so narrow where you're locking yourself in, you are like truly closing off, respiratory ability. Yeah. And people thought that was the case in road biking for a while, of like, oh, I'm going to from 42 centimeter bars to 38s, and like I'm closing it off. That's like not where the limit is. The limit totally lies like at the end of the range, right? But you can get around some of that by, it's okay if you widen them up a bit, and now you have a gap here, right? And that is the piece that is generally slow. So people filling that gap with, whether it's a sled or, just some sort of duct tape. Yeah, exactly. Something that fills that space between your arms is, now you're making one cohesive shape. That's the CD part of the CDA. You're making that shape faster, essentially. And that's where a lot of these products are, gaining a lot of traction. I know like Tri-Rig has a really cool system, but, a lot of people kind of locked into this fully custom route and realize they actually like need to make adjustments, right? And that's why I think a lot of people are going custom and then seeing that like, oh, actually like I need to do more tinkering. And that's why people may have gone back to poles. And, like the poles are not slow, right? Like the thing that matters the most is your body. And like this arm right here is way bigger than a pole. So whether that pole is like right out in front of it or, right up against it, it's not a huge piece of the equation. So you're gonna make like some pretty big gains by knowing like where to place your arms rather than what's near your arms.
Yeah, that's a good point about going down the custom route for anyone that is considering custom components. Is you are going to spend a lot of money, and your position might change in a year. There are a lot of variables that could make that, in hindsight, a bad idea, and wish you hadn't gone down that route, because you could get the custom sled and realize that it's not the optimal position for you, and you're forcing your body to fit this machine rather than fitting the machine to fit your body.
Exactly.
And can sometimes be not ideal. So let's talk about some other things not related to position, but some other trends that I've noticed this year. We chatted about this earlier this year. I think I reached out to you about like, where should I put my water bottle? Where are the best places for those setups? And I think like in triathlon, the two biggest places to put a water bottle are behind your saddle and in your cockpit. And I've noticed a couple changes this year around where exactly those bottles fit, but I wanted to see what you have noticed and why people are putting their hydration in different places than they were a couple years ago.
Again, the question is hard to answer because it super depends on the person and it super depends on the setup. Depending on where you place a bottle behind the saddle, like generally it's faster, but you could go plus or minus 5, maybe even 15 watts in some cases. A lot of the things we've seen are these products that allow you to position them differently. And, there's a few trade-offs here, right? Like you need to be able to grab the bottle as well as like it be in like an aerodynamic place, right? Like if you're sitting up and fumbling around for it for 20 to 30 seconds, you may have lost a huge amount
Yeah.
of the benefit in the first place.
And then you drop it and get a littering penalty, you know?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
these things
Yeah, like
happen
these are all
yeah.
factors you have to consider. There's actually a bunch of like interesting pages on Slow Twitch that I highly recommend on bottle placement, where people have gone through and digitally placed a lot of different bodies and seen where the most effective places to put bottles are. And as you may expect, like filling gaps is a huge benefit. If you're out here and you just close off all of this section, then now you've presented a faster shape to the wind.
Yeah. So what you're doing, you can almost create a sled by putting a water bottle between your forearms.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I highly recommend that. It's generally more comfortable too. So, I mean, those are the two places that are the most effective, and filling volume is generally the best place. The behind the saddle is a little bit more interesting because the ways in which it interacts with the wind can be somewhat variable. A while ago in the World Tour, there was this like concept of saddles with like extended plates behind them. Yeah. I know Dash used to make a saddle like that. They would call it like a splitter plate. And there's some argument as to how effective those actually were. The back kind of drops off pretty quickly when you're in a TT position. And it like, you can have a rounded back and it looks fairly gentle, but where your butt actually meets the saddle is a pretty sharp transition point where airflow can detach from your body, and now it's all turbulent, and that's like a lot of the place where you're being slowed down. So if you can smooth out that transition of airflow from off of your back onto or around the bottle, or let the bottle, interact with some of that turbulent air a little bit more easily, then that's kind of where your gains are. But because people's backs are, very variable, and like the helmet that they have too can impact some of this stuff, like how your helmet transitions to your back, and then where all that air is going is just, it's so dependent on the person.
And I think that's important to note, that there are a lot of brands out there. I'm thinking about Easy Gains, which is a product that a lot of professionals and amateurs have adapted this year, with their bottle placement up and behind their butt, not like down and behind the saddle. And it, they claim right in the tagline of that product that it's a 12-watt gain. And these products make these claims because they've tested it and achieved that one time in a wind tunnel with one person, and it might not always be the case. So everything we're talking about, trends, it's sometimes appropriate to look at them and pay attention to them, but other times it's, not great to identify these trends and try to adopt them for yourselves. Looking at triathlon this year, what's kind of like any type of equipment that's been like really strange to see, that even you are like kind of scratching your head about, like, that's an interesting product, or like that's an interesting fit, or anything that stood out to you this year?
Well, this one isn't like the newest, but the one that's kind of always been very intriguing to me is the Omnius headband, the one with all the cubes across of it. I think especially for a race like Kona, or something that's like really demanding in terms of environment, dealing with thermal and like managing your own bodily heat and how you can deal with that, I think is a really, really like interesting space to play, because it affects training, and it affects like your own physiology. There's just so many like factors at play. The Omnius, I believe it's Omnius headband, like their approach to deal with that, I think is very interesting. And I think that's kind of going to be the new wave, right? Like everybody's really focused on Aero because it matters a ton, and rightly so. I think it's like one of the most interesting aspects of the bike. That's like a huge reason why I'm in the industry. And I think Aero is everything, right? Like Specialized has said that for 10 years, and it is totally true. And now, a lot of people are optimizing around it. So staying ahead of the curve and realizing that, once you've got all your ducks in a row with Aero, dealing with your own physiology and being able to deal with heat, I think is a huge thing to think about. Yeah. And I've seen a lot of cool products that have come out. There's a Cool Tape, I think. I don't know if that's the brand name, but they make some really interesting materials for bar tape. I believe Sam Laidlow used strips of it on his cockpit at Kona. Oh wow, that was like 2024. But being able to dissipate heat and like do that effectively is really interesting, because there's both like a psychological effect and a physiological effect. Because if you feel hot, like you do not want to be working hard.
Yeah.
It sucks.
That's really interesting, because I haven't even, I mean, I had a weird, like, kind of futuristic discussion about this with my coach a few weeks ago, fresh off of 70.3 Cozumel, where I blew up in the heat. But thermal regulation on the run is something that a lot of athletes have been thinking about for years, but haven't quite figured out what products are available and can enhance that effect on the bike. And have you seen anything in like material design with helmets and kits yet, or is that something we're looking ahead to?
People are definitely thinking about it, and there's an interesting interplay of like how helmets interact with the wind to cool you down, because the environment that you're in also super matters on your cooling strategy. Like your sweat evaporating is a cooling mechanism, and if it's so humid that your sweat can no longer evaporate, that method of cooling is now out the window. So you got to think outside the box and like, how am I going to get rid of this heat, right? Like, am I going to put on an F1 suit that circulates cold water in tubing around my body? Like,
it's gonna
probably
happen.
not.
It's gonna happen eventually.
Eventually, yeah, right? Like, if the technology can catch up and like that's the way people want to pursue that problem, then yeah, cool. I would say gravel right now, like, at least in certain races like the Lifetime Series that aren't necessarily bound by UCI rules, there's a lot of interesting ways to deal with that. It's now actually banned in triathlon, but still, I believe, okay in gravel to have a camelback bladder down your jersey. And so there are products that came out recently for the most recent iteration of Unbound where people have jerseys that can now accommodate for a camelback bladder. And, now that's a huge opportunity to like cool yourself, right? Like have a big old bucket of cold water just strapped to you. There's, a whole bunch of other things going on there where like if you get yourself too cold and you create vasoconstriction around some of your blood vessels, then, now you have a different problem. But like cooling strategies are also environment dependent. So lots of cool stuff going on there.
Yeah. Are there any kind of innovations that you're working on that you can share a little bit about, or other things that other people are working on, kind of looking ahead to the future of triathlon and other bike endurance disciplines?
Yeah, I would say it just kind of always comes back to position, right? Like my like big tenet of cycling is like, go ride your bike and things are going to be better, assuming you don't get injured. And, all of that stuff comes to position. Like you're going to be more likely to ride if you're comfortable and happy, and you're going to go faster if you're comfortable and fast. And so all of those things circle around this just idea of position. If I can like leave it with anything, I'd say go get a fit.
Yeah. Great advice from the R&D engineer at Specialized. Go get a bike fit. We could go down all of these rabbit holes for hours, but we'll do more of this, I'm sure, in the future. But
absolutely.
Mitch, thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon. That was my conversation with Mitch Child, engineer at Specialized Bikes. If you have any questions about what we discussed or what we can discuss the next time we do a tech talk like this, feel free to send me a note on Instagram, and we'll add it to the list. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.